All right, welcome back to the channel. So Gary Russell Jr. in a recent interview is once again calling out Gervonta Davis and Oscar Valdez for a fight at 130 and said that he is willing to move up in weight. When asked about Chris Colbert, he was not that complimentary. Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. Oh, I love this video. We get to talk about the fighters that I really do like in the little weight classes. And the little weight classes, to me, I don't really talk too much about boxing if it's below 122 pounds, but 126, 100, and 135 pounds right now have, with I'm telling you, with almost only a little doubt, but they have some of the best fighters in the world in between those weight classes. And I believe the best guy in between those weight classes, between 122 and 135 pounds, pound for pound, is Gary Russell Jr. Now, Gary Russell Jr. is the longest reigning champion. He is the WBC featherweight champion of the world, which is 126 pounds. And he was recently on an interview asked about, the normal question that comes with Gary Russell Jr. When can we expect to see you in the ring again? It is a real tough thing for me, because I understand how many people would ask that question and say, yeah, I really love Gary Russell Jr. when he fights, but I really just wish he would fight some more. I really wish that I could see him fight some more, right? So, but for me, as somebody that watches all his fights and pretty much pays attention to everything that's going on in boxing, like I said, from 122 pounds and above, at 118 pounds, I may dip down there every once in a while, pay attention to King Ray Martinez, who's down there. I do believe he's down there at 112 pounds, right? And then, of course, there's some super fly weights. I think that's 118 pounds that are really solid fighters. Monster Inoue is a solid fighter, right? Guys like that. Juan Carlos Estrada is a solid fighter, but at 126 pounds or above that, when you pay attention to what's going on in the actual fighters' careers, it's hard for me to hold Gary Russell Jr. accountable for that, because if you compare him, for example, to Terrence Crawford is fighting 2 times a year, and you definitely get to see Terrence Crawford fight 2 times a year. But who is Terrence Crawford fighting in those 2 fights? He's not fighting anybody. The last fight that he had was, and I'm going to keep laying into Terrence Crawford, because just what he's doing with his, what he has done with his career and his reputation in the boxing, as far as a competition level that he's fought, it's absolutely ridiculous. But it's a very, very good example of somebody that fights 2 times a year, but you never see him fight anybody. Gary Russell Jr. fights 1 time a year, and he fights the mandatory that's put in front of him, and actually he winds up fighting very, pretty solid fighters in that weight class. But the problem is, nobody in that weight class, none of the champions, will fight him. Shakur Stevenson was a WBO champion at the same time as Gary Russell Jr., and Shakur Stevenson didn't fight him, for reasons that are obvious, being young in his career and somebody that's going to move up and somebody that you don't want to have lose to somebody like Gary Russell that early in their career. Also, you have guys like Josh Warrington, who wound up getting knocked out by Mauricio Lara, and so that answers a question as to why he wasn't willing to fight Gary Russell Jr. So, and then you have pretty much Leo Santa Cruz was in that division, was a champion. Up until recently, he wasn't willing to fight Gary Russell Jr. So what you get from Gary Russell Jr. is you get him fighting the guys that he's supposed to fight, but he's not fighting bum fights. And I personally think if he wound up taking 2 fights a year, what would you hear out of people's ears? Who has he fought? He's not fighting anybody. The guys that he's fighting are trash, because he would have to find somebody willing to fight him, and the guys willing to fight him are not the top level fighters. There's a ton of risk in there for anybody getting in the ring with Gary Russell Jr. However, he was asked in this interview what his plans are moving forward. And what he said was that he looked forward to the fighters that he wanted to fight are Gervonta Tank Davis and Oscar Valdez. And he said that he would be willing to move to 130 pounds if he could get those fights. Now, he's not, what he didn't say he was willing to do was move up to 130 pounds in hopes that and then fight at 130 pounds in hopes that he would get a title shot from these guys, because he said, look, there's nothing holding these guys to fight me if I move up there. So how do I know if I would get a fight up there if I just move up there? They would have to, and this makes sense for Gary Russell Jr., said he would have to know that these guys are going to fight him for him to move up and take that fight. And I think that would be a reasonable thing, seeing as a WBA champion in that same division, Leo Santa Cruz said, was able to do that exact thing. He kept his belt at 126. Then he fought and won, I do believe, a title at 130, but he had his belt at 126. And he wound up fighting Gervonta Davis, who was also a 130-pound champion. And basically, what happened? Leo Santa Cruz loses that fight, but then he still has the 126-pound title. So I don't see why there should be any different consideration given to Gary Russell Jr. in allowing him to fight somebody in 130 pounds and have that, but not have his 126-pound belt on the line. So in that regard, he says that the fighters that he wants to fight is Gervonta Davis and Oscar Valdez. Now, he was asked about Leo Santa Cruz in his own weight class, and what he said was that he doesn't believe that fight carries as much weight as it used to, but hey, it's a unification fight, so he would be willing to fight Leo Santa Cruz. If Leo Santa Cruz is willing to come and get that, what he says, if he's willing to come over there and get beat, he's willing to take the fight. And I'm glad that he took that line of reasoning, because at first he was like, man, I don't know if it really carries the same weight. But then he thought about it. He's like, hold on, he's still a champion at 126. Absolutely, I'll fight fight him. So, and Leo Santa Cruz said that he would be interested in fighting Gary Russell Jr. It seems like that is a peanut butter and chocolate type of situation. Peanut butter and chocolate means the Reese's cup, right? I'm not just saying black and brown, but now that, hey, the analogy works, or the metaphor works, whatever the one of that is. But he said what he would rather do, though, is he'd rather fight Gervonta Tank Davis and Oscar Valdez at 130 pounds. But the problem is that there's not a lot of boxing fans that are really pushing for these guys to take those fights, because full well that Gary Russell Jr. may beat those guys. Gary said that he feels comfortable from anywhere from 126 to 135 pounds. And I'm telling you, that guy would be trouble for anybody in those weight classes, because he has defense. Now, when he talked about why he believed that Gervonta Tank Davis is somebody that he could beat, he pointed to the Mario Barrios fight and said, man, if you look at that fight, Gervonta Tank Davis, if Mario Barrios had good, solid defense, Mario or Barrios, people keep asking me to say one name. Look, man, if I don't know Mario Barrios, I want to say the whole name, because I don't want to call him Mario, because I don't know him. But anyway, Mario, he said if Mario was defensively responsible, that since he was up on the cards, he should have been able to go at least, I think it was like a 9th or 10th round knockout, that he could have held his defense and jabbed and stayed on the outside for another 12 rounds, and Gervonta Davis would have lost that fight. So he's not sure whether or not Gervonta's team with Floyd would be willing to go ahead and make that fight. But anyway, I'm just happy to hear that Gary Russell Jr. is looking to get back in the ring. Hopefully we'll see him fight soon, and I'm really hoping that he will get one of these fights at 130, specifically the Gervonta Tank Davis fight, because he's right in what he said when Gary said, look, that the fight between Gary and Tank was going to sell no matter where it is, and it's a bigger fight than the fight with Barrios. So why not make the fight? Well, we know why not make the fight, not make the fight because, people in Gervonta Davis's camp are rightfully should be concerned about whether Gervonta Davis can win that fight. Just because you beat bigger guys doesn't mean that you're going to fight. Just because you beat a good bigger guy doesn't mean that you're going to beat a great smaller guy. And the skill set difference between Barrios and Gary is gigantic. But anyway, that's my thoughts. You let me know what you think. And with that, I'm out. Peace.